While Senator Joe Biden has only just been chosen as the Democratic vice presidential nominee, Shalom TV met the senator and discussed his views on issues important to the Jewish nation.
I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
It promised a land of safety and peace. But the Zionist dream became a Palestinian nightmare. Is Zionism still about the right to self-determination? Or is even its liberal variety just a form of colonialism? Today, Israel takes pride in saying it's the only democracy in the region. But for Palestinians living on both sides of the wall, things look very different. I'm Mehdi Hassan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Shlomo Ben-Ami, the former Foreign Minister of Israel. One of the most influential voices on the Israeli left, he came close to ending the conflict in 2001, but failed. Today, I'll challenge him on whether liberal Zionism is compatible with liberal democracy, and whether it can ever produce a just settlement for the Palestinians. I'll also be joined by three experts tonight who will share their perspectives. Renowned Israeli historian Professor Avi Schleim, Paul Charney, chairman of the Zionist Federation of Great Britain, and Diana Boutou, a Palestinian lawyer and former PLO legal advisor. Ladies and gentlemen, Shlomo Ben-Ami. He considers himself an ardent Zionist, but also a liberal and left-wing Democrat. Thanks, Shlomo, for coming. Thanks so much. Shlomo Ben-Ami, you would presumably describe yourself as a liberal, as a man of the left, as a Democrat, and yet you also describe yourself as an ardent Zionist. Is it possible to be both a liberal and a Zionist?
Of course it is possible. I would refer you to the initial Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, where it says that this is about the ingathering of the exiles based on ancestral certificates of belonging, but one that is also respectful of the rights of minorities, ethnic groups, religions, gender. And I would add to it the definition that the founder of Zionism, Herzl, gave at the time, that this is about the creation of a Jewish state based on the laws of the nations. On international law, you would say today. If Israel respects all these parameters, this is the Zionism that I'm an ardent supporter of.
So how would you define Zionism in a way that's, say, different to the way that a settler defines Zionism, or even Benjamin Netanyahu defines Zionism?
Well, I say that in my book. I put the limits in the borders of 1948. I think that a state that is part of the community of nations should not settle beyond its internationally recognized borders. Admittedly, the 1948 borders were not recognized internationally, and one of the meanings, in my view, perhaps the main meaning of the 1967 war, is that it has legitimized the 1948 borders in the eyes of the Arab world.
How does a political ideology, which at its core is about privileging a particular ethnic group, presumably over other ethnic groups, how do you reconcile that with the principles of liberalism, which is about equal rights for all, equal citizenship for all?
I think you need an effort to reconcile the two, to square the circle. It's not easy. But I do agree that there is a fundamental anomaly in the creation of the State of Israel. This perhaps can explain the controversy around the Jewish state, because it was created in a very particular way. And given the background of Jewish history as we know it. But I do believe that enlightened leadership and more sober political construction in Israel could have reached that kind of squaring the circle.
But when you talk about squaring the circle or anomaly, some people go further. They say there is inherent more than just a tension, there's a contradiction. When you talk of being a Jewish and democratic state, it's like talking about hot ice. It's a contradiction in terms, it's an oxymoron.
No, it is not an oxymoron. I mean, you can be a Jewish state where the Jews are a majority, but is fully, unconditionally respectful of the minorities. Look, without declaring it, many other states throughout the world gave priority to a majority ethnic or religion.
You're right. So if we take the United States, for example, you could say there's a big debate about indigenous people there, Australia. The difference, surely, is that in the nature of Zionism, surely it's about preserving a Jewish majority. And that Jewish majority, of course, came about by expelling some of the Palestinians who were living within those original borders, those UN-mandated borders. You wouldn't have a Jewish majority and a Jewish state had you not expelled Palestinians along the way.
Well, this is the way the State of Israel was created. I'm not trying to whitewash the anomaly in the creation of the State of Israel by saying that nations normally throughout history were born in blood and were born in sin. The difference is that Israel was born in the age of mass media. Imagine that the United States would have been born in the age of mass media after the elimination of the indigenous people.
Today, the United States does not say it is the nation or the country of one particular ethnic group or religion. And whereas the Jewish state is called the Jewish state, you are, in its very title, is privileging one group of people over another group of people who happen to live within that state's borders. Well, that's why people talk about it's an ethnocracy, not a democracy, some suggest.
You need to see that against the background of Jewish history. Now what we need is to reconcile that complex historical background with what a normal state should be.
Let me go to our panel. Dr. Avi Schleim is one of Israel's best-known historians. He's a Professor Emeritus of International Relations here at Oxford University. Professor Schleim, do you think there's a contradiction inherent within the Zionist project?
No, I do not think that liberalism and Zionism are a contradiction in terms. Zionism isn't a monolithic movement. Zionism is a pluralist movement, and there are many different strands of Zionism. And Professor Ben-Ami represents the most liberal strand within the Zionist movement, and he represents the views of a handful, a few percent of the Israeli population. But mainstream Zionism has never been liberal. The gap between the lofty Zionist ideals and the reality of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians on the ground has always been so huge that Zionist leaders filled it with hypocrisy and humbug.
You describe yourself, I believe, as a post-Zionist. What is that?
It means that I'm not an anti-Zionist because I accept Zionism as the national liberation movement of the Jews. But I believe that the Zionist project was achieved by 1967. There was a viable Jewish state in the Middle East. And I would have liked Israel to have given back all the territories to trade them for peace so that everyone could get on with their lives, both Israelis and Arabs. And 1967 is a great watershed. Before 1967, Israel had considerable international legitimacy. It lost it in the aftermath of the war because it became a colonial power ruling over an Arab population.
Let me bring in Paul Charney, who is chairman of the Zionist Federation of Britain and Ireland, a former lieutenant in the Israeli army. Avi Schleim says that there's no inherent contradiction, he believes, between Zionism and liberalism and democracy, but the gap has been filled. In practice, the gap has been filled by hypocrisy and humbug. What's your response to that?
I disagree with the premise of the question. I disagree with some of what my esteemed colleague has been saying. Let's come back to what Zionism is. Zionism was formed in the late 19th century as an answer, as a solution to the Jewish people who were persecuted around the world. The world itself defined Zionism by telling the Jewish people, no matter where you live, at any point of history, at any time, you are not safe. And the liberal Zionists at the time came up with the conclusion that we need a Jewish homeland, a safe Jewish homeland in our Jewish historical national homeland for the Jewish people, and then we will be safe.
Let me bring in Diana Boutou, who is a Palestinian law and activist, former legal advisor to the PLO between 2000 and 2005. And I believe your parents were born in what is now Israel, and you have Israeli citizenship as well.
Indeed.
Shlomo Ben-Ami says every country is born in sin. Why do you think Israel is any different then?
It's very different. The fact of the matter is that the Zionist movement and Zionism on the ground is the idea of creating not only a Jewish state, but at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian population. What Zionism is the idea of privileging and giving exclusive rights to one group of people at the expense of another group of people. This isn't liberal. This isn't relating to equality. There isn't a single Zionist who's able to say that they actually believe that Palestinians have the exact same rights as Israelis who are living in that country. And this is the fundamental problem with Zionism.
What's your response to Diana?
Well, Arab Israelis share in some way the predicament of Jews in the diaspora in the following sense, that they are equal by the law to the Jewish part of the population. But real life has discriminated against Arab Israelis in many fields.
700,000 Palestinians left what is now Israel. They didn't just all run away out of choice. In many cases, they were driven out. Do you accept that you would not have the Jewish majority and the Jewish state today without that original act, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe?
History offered different options. 1947 was one option. You could have had an Israeli Jewish state without expulsion.
If you hadn't had the expulsion, you wouldn't have a Jewish majority.
This fact of history is today one of the major reasons that the Israeli right of center is ready to engage in a peace process in order to give away lands in the West Bank. The fear of a demographic doomsday. That's always been one of the central issues in this process.
And would you accept that the Jewish state was built on an act of ethnic cleansing then?
Well, there were elements of ethnic cleansing, there is no doubt about it. The story of Lida, of Lod. So there were obviously cases, and there were many other cases where the country was bisected by war, and people ran away out of fear. I don't believe that there was a master plan.
Let's assume it was all an accident. Let's assume the Palestinians all ran away out of choice. You didn't let them come back. It's all very well acknowledging the history and saying that was unfortunate, this may have been ethnic cleansing. But I'm asking you, you say today I'm an ardent Zionist. That's part of the legacy of Zionism.
Well, I accept it as it is.
But you don't say I don't want to therefore take the tag of an ideology that produced that.
And trying to reconcile the price that was paid by everybody in this conflict with a decent state of affairs. That is what is to be liberal today.
Let's talk about that, but Paul Charney wants to come in here. Paul?
In the 1950s, there was a Jewish majority in that land because the Arab nations expelled 800,000 Jews and they had nowhere to go but Israel. The Arabs have created as much of a Jewish population in Israel as the Palestinians.
Why haven't the refugees been allowed to return? Because the fundamental issue is that you view Palestinians as a demographic threat and that you don't believe in equality for Palestinians.